Hi, folks. Welcome to a thrilling new episode of the Medical Device Cybersecurity Podcast. I'm here joined with Christian Guesty, and we're going to talk today about the security of medical devices and specifically ISO standards that we have to follow, 14971 and 8100151. So some of the challenging standards that we have to follow as medical device manufacturers. We're going to talk about the differences, what they mean, and how we can apply them safely to our medical devices. Christian, welcome to the Medical Device Cybersecurity Podcast.
Yeah, hello. My name is Christian. I'm currently working as a consultant for medical device industry, and in my previous life I was starting with medical device engineering degree at university, and then worked as a software developer in the medical device industry. Later on switched to quality management and regulatory affairs, and so I ended up as a consultant to share my knowledge.
So cool. And you publish a lot on LinkedIn on how medical device manufacturers can protect themselves against cybersecurity. I'm curious, how did that last transition happen for you? How did you switch from regulatory affairs to cybersecurity?
Yeah, that was a little bit based on my knowledge in software development and a little bit on my motivation, because I always wanted to make medical devices more safe and more performant. And now security is one of the topics that comes on top of it to make them more secure. And this was always a vision or a mission of mine, to discuss that with medical device manufacturers and to encourage them to do so.
Okay, wonderful. That's a great mission that we share to make medical devices safer. So, Christian, you've posted quite a bit on the topics of ISO 14971, and just can you describe for us what's the relevance of this standard for medical devices, and where does cybersecurity fit into the bigger piece of the puzzle?
Yeah. ISO 14971 is a standard that deals with risk management for medical devices. And risk management is a very important topic in the medical device industry, because you not only follow structured approaches for lifecycle management of devices, you always have to do a parallel process to ask what can go wrong. So whatever you design is challenged by the risk management process. And the risk management process should find sources of events that can occur that have an impact on safety and performance. And if you extend that concept, you end up with security, where you also say security issues must be found right before the device is placed on the market. So you are able to find the corresponding risk controls for security. So risk management is the overall tool for everything, to identify potential issues, potential problems, and find the corresponding risk control measures.
And you have a past where you said you were overall in regulatory affairs. What are some things that you find perhaps more applicable to cyber or less applicable to cyber from ISO 14971?
Interesting question. When I first thought about implementing security risk management, I was not so aware of 14971. Later on, with the latest version of ISO 14971 2019, I recognized that the framework completely fits to the concept of security risk management. So when you look at that framework or that process, then you see you first have to identify assets and security-related characteristics. You have to write down your intended use, which is the environment of the device. And that is your starting point to identify risks. Identifying risk means you apply a method. The specific method might be threat modeling. And then you deal with those identified risks. You have to estimate them, and you have to find risk control measures. And in the end, you make your overall statement about what kind of risks did I find and how were they mitigated. So the overall risk management process described in 14971 can completely, entirely fit to security risk analysis or risk management.
Because we've talked about threat modeling before in this podcast, the whole process of selecting a specific risk, then talking about what are the implications of that risk, and afterwards, what do you do, and then finally, how you evaluate it. So is there a similar process in regulatory affairs when we talk about certain risk, maybe compatibility, biocompatibility and things like this? Is it the same process, or are we talking about something completely different when we talk about cyber?
It's a little bit different because you are not focusing so much on the end effect that you want to achieve, because end effect is to prevent health issues with patients, users and third party. That's the overall goal of 4971. And the goal in between is to ensure data or to ensure that there's no data impact like confidentiality impact, integrity impact or availability impact. And in order to achieve that, you have the security risk management process. But if you finish that, you can say, now my data is somehow under control, but there is a residual risk. And this residual risk is then transferred to the 4971 level, where you observe the possible impacts on safety and performance. And this is a little bit different to the others, because for biocompatibility or things like that, you directly focus on health impacts in the sense of safety and performance.
So it's a two-step process where first you isolate the implications for health, and then take these implications for health, take them through a process of 14971, and then just make decisions based on that. Okay, so how does this differ from the other standard that we're interested in, IEC 8100151?
Yeah, this is a standard that describes the structured lifecycle process to ensure security by design. So that's simply a constructive framework that describes what to do in the course of the development and maintenance of the device. So first you put down all your security requirements, then you make a design review on them, then you transfer the security requirements into a security architectural design, then you go further with implementation, more specific design, and then you go through the testing process, system tests specifically for security, and finally the release of the device from the perspective of security. So that's what is described in the 81001-5-1. And this is not the same as the risk management process. The risk management process is just one activity in that overall lifecycle process that I currently described, because the risk management process challenges what you did in the structured approach. So the 81001-5-1 tells you what to do in the life cycle, and the risk management is an accompanying process that always challenges everything that you do in the 81001-5-1 process.
I see. That's really interesting of a dynamic, right? And so there can be a temptation for medical device manufacturers to just, especially when it comes to cyber, it's a bit more complex, and you said it's two-phased, to disregard some piece of it, such as taking care only of it at the end of the process, right? So how do you, as a medical device manufacturer, you don't want to do this because it can be costly, it can lead to your approval not being approved, your submission not being approved. So how do you deal with working both at once? What are some tips that you have there?
The best recommendation is to start right with the beginning of the project, to implement security by design from the first moment of your development. And then you are sure that you do not need to reinvent the wheel or to redesign your product due to findings in security. So it's a strong recommendation to do both from the very beginning. And another really important indication or recommendation is that you use the risk management process to continuously challenge what you have designed. So if your architectural design is finished, you go to the threat modeling method, or you use it to identify vulnerabilities or problems in the architectural design. And by that, you identify risk control measures that are, again, input to the development process. So they are the risk control measures are then handed over to the development process and used as requirements again into the development process. And by that, you might need to change the architectural design again. And so it's an iterative approach that is continuing through the entire life cycle of the product.
And I guess also ISO 14971, the risk management process, is also a feedback loop, right? Where you keep analyzing risk and determine if it's enough and hopefully arrive where something you're settled. So how do you manage both cycles? Do you go like once a week, we'll have a team meeting with all the different risk holders, stakeholders, and then talk about it?
It depends a lot on the size of the company and the structure of the company and the capabilities of the software developers. Sometimes the software developers themselves do the security management, so they do not only the implementation and the architectural design, but also the security stuff. In this case, it's more or less an ongoing activity by more or less one person, or how many persons you have involved. But if you have a bigger company structure, then it might be that you have two different teams, one for security risk management and one for the core development process. And there it could be that you, for example, say, whenever I do a redesign of my architectural design, and whenever I have a new released version of my architectural design, then I hand it over to the security risk management team, and they evaluate it, do their threat modeling activity, and come back with a new or updated security risk control list. So risk security requirements to be incorporated again in the development lifecycle.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And you know, a lot of what we do at medical device manufacturers has to be documented for obvious purposes, for audits, for submissions, etc. Mm-hmm. How do you suggest document flows should work? What are some good practices that you've seen?
Yeah, the most important thing is that you should use a system that ensures that the documents are more or less released, so they are controlled in the sense of document control, so that you exactly know this is a new version that I can incorporate in my process. Because otherwise it's still on the flow and you never know, is it changed within the next minute? So a sound release-based system or work environment should be the base of the regulatory work. And then it is very important to keep traceability. So if you write down one security requirement, this security requirement must be traced down through the design, through the specific implementation in the code, down to test specifications and test reports, but also back to the risk management, because every security risk requirement or every security requirement is more or less a security risk control. So there must also be that traceability to the risk management. And to keep all those traces, it's highly recommended to use tools like an ALM tool, PLM tool, or maybe databases. Some manufacturers work with Confluence and Jira, and they use Jira to keep all those traces.
So yeah, a Google Sheets, a shared doc won't just do it.
It will work, but it's more difficult, and it's a lot of manual work that you have to do.
Speaking of tools, what are some that you've seen work especially good for cybersecurity documentations in general?
The final documentation can be done with Word and Excel, but the question is, how is the stuff in between maintained? So any kind of ALM tool, Polarion or any other tool can be used for that. And many manufacturers still use Excel, by the way, because they have no other tool so far implemented. Yeah.
I think the coordination is especially important in these type of environments where there's a lot of moving spaces, as you say. So if you're a company and you want to align yourself to I think the 14971 standard is pretty understood by the medical device space. What if you want to align yourself to 81001? Yeah.
Dash 5-1.
Yeah, exactly. How would you start if you were looking today to apply this standard to your organization?
Would try to understand the overall expectation from the lawgivers, meaning that you look into the MDR, IVDR to understand what is the general obligation towards manufacturers, and then you will see that it is not so much, and it is very unspecific because they just say you have to implement security according to the state of the art, full stop. So you need additional advice, and then you go down to the MDCG 2019-16 revision 1, where you find more explanation about what is meant by information security according to the state of the art, but it's still very fuzzy or unspecific. And then you enter the 81001-5-1. And if you have already experience with the software development lifecycle according to IEC 62304, it's quite easy to get into the 81001-5-1 because it's the same structure, the same phases, development phases as in IEC 62304. But there's still problem with many manufacturers to get into the topic because they are absolutely new in the security field, so they don't understand the terms that are used. For example, what is a software bill of material? What is defense in depth? What is a penetration test? Things like that. And for that, I suggest to consume standard literature about security because all the things that are mentioned in the standard are exactly as described in every other literature about security. So you can use any kind of basic starter literature to cybersecurity to get into the topics or to get into the terms. And of course, the easiest way would be to join a seminar because there you get the information presented in a very condensed way, and it's a quick way to get into that.
Yeah, for sure. There's great events happening all around. What I found for me is that this standard's 81001-151, okay, maybe too many ones, but is that it's a great overall recap of many different standards, many different pieces of legislations that tell you in all in one how to apply this across the life cycle of a product. Have you shared this perspective?
I would not fully confirm because it's dealing with the standard lifecycle process, especially in the sense of security by design. There are many other standards that do not deal with the creation of software so much. They are more focused on the operation of software, like the ISO 27001. It's about a quality management system to ensure that your IT infrastructure is well secured. So more the operational activities. The 81001-5-1 is very specific to the core development process and the post-market surveillance afterwards.
That's true, yeah. That's it's something to know as well. You have to secure your organization. We've talked about this. I want to talk about your experience, Christian, from your cybersecurity perspective. What is how have you seen standards, the integration of processes such as 8100151 helped organizations improve their efficiency in cybersecurity?
I saw that they first had a lot of struggle with implementing it because they were so much refusing it, because they just were focused on, oh my gosh, it's additional work. We can't manage that on top of all other requirements, because many manufacturers were still in the transition to MDR, IVDR, or are still in that transition. So they have no capacity to implement such a standard or such a topic like cybersecurity. But nevertheless, it's one of the most important topics at all at the moment, because we have so many impacts from the market, real threats in the market. And we have just everyday ransomware attacks on hospitals or on health infrastructure, so they have to implement it. And your question was about how did they implement it, or what are their struggles? Or you specifically asked what is the efficiency boost by that standard. Yes, there is an efficiency boost, because if they implement the 81001-5-1, then they have, from the very beginning of the development process, a clear vision, a clear strategy of how to implement it. And you know the rule of 10th, which means that if you do a mistake in your development process, the cost of removing that mistake increases from step to step by the factor of 10. So that means if you, in the end of the development process, recognize that there's a big issue with IT security and you have to fix that, the cost is extremely high. So it's very good to have identified that problem or that issue right in the beginning. Maybe on the paperwork, if you write down your security requirements and you miss some requirements, if you do a proper design review, you will recognize that there's a problem and then you can fix it easily. In the end, if your finished product is on the table, you have to revise the entire software. So it's much more work to fix that error than.
Yeah, always.
So
Than doing it from the start.
Yeah, that's the big advantage in the sense of getting more efficient if you implement a standard like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So if you want to do things right, you have to start implementing early and make sure that things are going accurately. So if before you move on to the next step, you're making sure that each requirement is fulfilled. What are some ways of verification of these implementations that you've seen being successful? Maybe what are some of the overrated ones that you think should not always be used?
I don't think that there's an overrated one, because every type and method of verification has its own purpose, and every method has a specific outcome. So, for example, if you verify whether your security requirements are implemented, that is for sure the verification and giving evidence that everything that you considered in the development process was really implemented correctly. So this is a must-have verification. Another one is vulnerability monitoring or vulnerability scanning. That means once that you identify well-known vulnerability types in your system, and this is also very efficient because there are huge lists of known vulnerabilities, and if you systematically monitor them or scan them, then you can be sure that you fixed or avoided all problems that are well known. This is one thing that belongs to vulnerability scanning. Another thing is that you use your software bill of material, your inventory list of third-party components, to identify the known vulnerabilities of third-party components. And if you do that, you are aware of any known vulnerability in your current system. And that is also a must-have verification. And another one is penetration testing. Penetration testing means that you use the skills and capacities of real hackers, at least the knowledge that they have, in order to attack your system. And the statement is, if they are able to attack the system, then the bad guys outside will also have the possibility to hack your system. And if not, then it's kind of evidence that your system is kind of stable. So every method that you apply in the system testing has its purpose, and it makes highly sense to do that. And I would not say that any kind of method that is described by the standard is not really necessary or something like that.
Yeah, all of them there have their plus and minus. You have so many of them. It's just about finding what's right for you. For instance, if we're talking about penetration testing, we have to choose. It's more of a technique that you use towards the end of it, and it's also something that you use to prove to your notified body or the FDA that you've done your job, right? This is part of that last process.
Yeah, it's an evidence for the authorities and notified bodies, but also for yourself, because you also want to have secure devices, but because otherwise it's a business impact or business threat for your product or for you as a company. So penetration test has different meanings for the authorities as well as for the company. And in the end, penetration test is only the method. The kind of penetration test that you apply depends on you. So if you have just one physical interface, the penetration test is done within a few hours. If you have a complex web application distributed over several cloud instances, then the penetration test is much more extensive, and it may last for 2 weeks or something like that, including physical penetration tests, which means that attackers try to attack your company. They went into your company and try to attack the system inside your company, which is also a kind of attack surface from the perspective of the product. So penetration test is just the method, and the kind of implementation is defined within the penetration test plan. So the method itself is always necessary, but the extent, and by that the cost of penetration test, has to be planned carefully.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where we talk about starting things early. Oftentimes, I recommend people to start mapping out what the device is going to look like. You talk about different interfaces, and if the more complex they are, the more you have to plan it out, because then if you want to do something like a penetration test, you want to do it at the point where it makes most sense, because if you're going to do it everywhere, it might be too costly. But if you can justify why you do it at a very specific place, in a very specific context, then you don't have to make it all this big and fancy. So just focusing on the essential is a great way, and mapping out things is very helpful to do that.
Yeah, sure.
So if cybersecurity can be, oftentimes, I'm sure you get this all the time, it can be sometimes seen as a cost for the medical device organization that already has plenty of costs, as we know. How, from there, if you're advising a medical device manufacturer to see cybersecurity as a different kind of spending, as something that's required, what are some arguments that you usually take out of conversations?
Yeah, the problem is that cybersecurity has a lot more impact on the company, but also on people that might be affected by cybersecurity. So, for example, if there's a data breach and you have problems with data privacy and the corresponding laws, that can have tremendous penalty costs that you have to cover by your company, and that is an impact on the company that is different maybe to the medical device industry itself, coming from the health impacts, because with health impacts you mostly have a limited number of patients, but with the impacts of cybersecurity it can be a different story. For example, with data breaches where millions of data records can be stolen, or with cyber attacks where your device is, for example, the entry point to a hospital network, and by that a ransomware attack is done, then the whole hospital stops its operation, and that could be another dimension of impact. And if your company is cited in the news, your company name is used in the news, together with such an impact, such a ransomware attack or whatever, that has also tremendous impacts on the business of that company. So not only on people, but also on the company and the business. Yeah, and that is why cybersecurity has a different meaning for the manufacturer, because it has a different impact.
Yeah, different impact. Yeah, it's much wider, the scope of touching, right? And data privacy is especially a big concern in very litigious countries such as the US, Canada, the UK. And Europe. We see it more and more in Europe. We're seeing laws that are governing data, such as the Netherlands, trying to... I think it's good. We need to protect patients' data, and this is definitely costing company. Christian, I want to finish soon. If you have one tip for medical device manufacturers when it comes to their cybersecurity in general, what would you advise them?
Strongly take it serious, because it's a problematic field. We have more and more threats outside, not only to the product, but also to your company, because medical device manufacturers can't work and cannot earn money if their business is down due to ransomware attack, for example. So cybersecurity, product-wise and infrastructure-wise, is a high priority nowadays, because we face so many attacks nowadays.
Yeah, wonderful. Christian, if people want to hear more about you, where can they go?
First to LinkedIn, my profile is there. I post a lot about cybersecurity, and my company where I work, Jona Institute, is also findable in the internet.
Yeah, and we'll put the links down below in the description. Okay. Christian, thank you so much for coming on the Medical Device Cybersecurity Podcast.
Thank you. Bye.